Welcome to this lecture entitled Thinking About Slavery and Systemic Oppression. And what I want to do is just give a little context on the PowerPoint presentation that you received via email that just provides a broad overview of the topic of slavery, how it intersects with American history, and why it's important to sort of understand the history of slavery that, of course, then leads into the segregation system that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was challenging. You can't really understand King's writings without understanding him within this sort of broader context of addressing issues that come out of the history of slavery. But in order to sort of understand the context of slavery in America, I really want to help you to think a little bit about the topic of slavery more broadly, and then we'll sort of move into the American context and then end our time talking about why it's important to think systemically about slavery. So the PowerPoint presentation that you received via email consists of about 38 slides. And, I've sort of divided it up a couple ways. The first part is just kind of entitled Thinking About Slavery. Then the second part is just providing some facts and some context on American slavery and how it evolved. Then the latter part of the PowerPoint presentation kind of deals with how systemic oppression continued after slavery, which is something that's very, very important, and then what it means to sort of do justice work. And the reason I've sort of structured the presentation this way is so that you understand that by the time you get to the end of the PowerPoint slides, it gives you helpful context on what it is that King is trying to do. Because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spends a lot of time talking about justice. And in order to understand and be able to situate King as an intellectual and as a thinker and as a Christian leader, you have to understand that what justice is trying to do, it's trying to deal with the systemic issues that come out of the history of slavery and racism. And I want to get you out of this frame of mind of thinking about racism as just personal prejudice. Okay, that's a part of it. But really, if you're going to understand what King is doing, and if you really want to understand the reason racism persists, you have to begin to think from a systemic standpoint. We're not talking about individuals who have stereotypical or prejudicial views about blacks. So we think as a society, because you don't have masses of whites calling blacks the N-word, that racism has somehow gone away. And the reason that's flawed is because you're not thinking of racism as a system of advantage for whites and a system that also disadvantages African Americans. So we'll kind of get into that in the presentation. And the reason I'm doing this, again, so that we have to stop lifting King out of his historical context. And one of the reasons King has just become a caricature in American society, they say, oh, King was a dreamer who had a vision for everyone, for a better world. Yes, but King was challenging this system of Jim Crow segregation. And that needs to be a part of our sort of narrative when we are always talking about King and the work that he's done, that we keep him in his context and we stop sanitizing what happened historically. Because yes, King had a vision for all people. He was also challenging systems of oppression coming out of Jim Crow segregation. He was challenging systems that create mass poverty. So when he was assassinated in 1968, okay, this was during a time where he took up the Poor People's Campaign. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, with sanitation workers. So he was taking up these issues of systemic poverty, and he was assassinated trying to challenge these systems of oppression. So the first part of the slide, I reference a book that's very, very important, written by Orlando Patterson. It's entitled Slavery and Social Death. And the reason Patterson's work is so important is because Patterson spent time studying slavery across history. Places like Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, places in Africa, the Caribbean, as well as the American South. And Patterson's work is important because what he tries to do is he tries to help you to understand that there are similarities between all these systems of slavery, whether you're talking about slavery in antiquity versus whether you're talking about modern slavery. And some of the things that he lifts up, and you'll see in your PowerPoint presentation, is that, one of the key terms he uses is the permanence of slavery. So a lot of times people like to talk about, well, individual slaves, they were slaves for a little while and then they got their freedom. But the system was intact. So yes, a person could kind of move in and out of that system, but there's this sort of permanent feature when a society adopts slavery as a way to generate wealth for a relatively small number of people, while marginalizing and exploiting and using and dehumanizing masses of people to build wealth. He also talked about being natally alienated. That term, to be natally alienated, means that, hey, when you give birth to your child, you don't have rights if you are an enslaved person as to the kind of life you want for your child. If you're a slave, you have children, your child is a slave, your child doesn't even belong to you, your master is deciding the fate of your child. So can you imagine you giving birth to a child that someone is standing over you with an option to sell your child if they want to, and you have no say-so in that. And another term he uses just that they're dishonored persons, so that they're really not viewed as persons of having worth, being children of God, viewed in a sort of equitable manner. A lot of times enslaved persons are viewed as inferior. One Greek philosopher referred to slaves as inanimate objects. They're just kind of things. You're talking about humans, referring to them as objects and treating them like their property. So Patterson's work is important to sort of help you to understand that there are some sort of basic elements and common characteristics of slavery across history. But I do want to caution you from being too flat in your understanding of slavery, because there are some differences between slavery in America versus slavery in let's just say the Greco-Roman period during the time of Jesus and the first Christians. For example, in American slavery, race played a huge role. So by the time you really get into the antebellum period, they really develop a sort of sophisticated ideology and theology that says that Africans are supposed to be enslaved, that God cursed them. So while during the colonial period, they did try to enslave Native Americans, you would even have white men and white women who were debt slaves. That did not become a sort of permanent fixture on the landscape of America. What became a permanent fixture was Africans being enslaved. So the racial component, you didn't have that in the Greco-Roman period. If you were a part of a nation or a state, you went to war against the Roman Empire and lost. If you weren't killed, you would be enslaved. So they didn't sort of have this ideology that there's a particular race of persons who were supposed to be enslaved. Now that's an invention of modernity, of the sort of modern era. So that's kind of an important example. Another sort of difference between modern and ancient slavery would be that in the Greco-Roman era, slaves had sometimes very highly sensitive jobs. They could be things like sea captains, provincial governors, physicians, administrators, as well as occupying, lower level positions like, working in the mines, working in the belly of these ships where it's just your job to row all day. But in the American system of slavery, you did not have enslaved Africans who were, physicians and accountants and administrators. They were really working to produce, hey, they were working in the cotton industry, rice, tobacco, sugar. Okay. So again, that's another important difference, because what I want you to do is I want you to kind of have a nuanced and a complex understanding of slavery. And something that's very interesting that you'll find is that America is a member of these other nations like Greece and Rome, Egypt, who built empires on the backs of the enslaved. And I think that the reason I want to sort of stop for a moment and just flag that and tag that as something that's important is because I think that should develop in everyone in this country a different kind of historical perspective that should inform how we go about being a nation on the other side of having enslaved so many people. And that's really not the case. We in this country, we really try to ignore the history of slavery. We try to pretend from a national standpoint that none of this happened or that it does not have a bearing on our society today. So one of the things I would like for you to do is to just sort of pause the video and answer a couple of questions for me. The first question is this: why do we as a country try to forget and or minimize the role and the impact of slavery in America? So why do we try to forget? Why do we try to ignore and minimize the impact slavery has had on our country? The second question is, can something as significant as the enslavement of millions of persons over 240 years be ignored and not impact a country for years to come? So I want you to kind of spend some time unpacking that. I mean, can you really ignore over 240 years of enslavement and all the systems that get created during this period that pretty much set the trajectory for a country? Can you dismiss that? Can you assume that has no impact? So spend some time answering that question and we'll continue. All right, well, I hope the discussion was engaging, and I'm looking forward to coming back and kind of seeing some of the things that you shared. Now, so let's just shift gears a little bit and just spend a couple moments thinking about American slavery. While there are some differences between what was going on in the American slave system and ancient forms of slavery, I just kind of want you to understand just a few, I think, interesting facts, and then we'll kind of spend some time talking about, I think, two very, very important issues. One interesting fact is that it's 2019, and in this country, we're celebrating the sort of 400-year anniversary of slavery in America that started in Jamestown in 1619, when 20 Africans arrived on a ship and were sold to English colonists. So that's sort of a part of our national narrative. But a fact that you'll find interesting is that actually Africans were on the continent almost a century earlier. They were with the Spaniards, Portuguese, they were explorers. So they were actually on the North American continent, particularly in Spanish Florida, exploring. They were not there as enslaved persons. So you know, that's just something that a lot of people don't really think. They think the first time Africans set foot on this continent was in 1619. That's not the truth. Another interesting historical fact is that, you know, the 20 Africans that arrived in Jamestown, they were from Angola, and one of the enslaved Africans' name was Angela. You can actually go and spend some time in Jamestown, in Virginia, and there's a lot of work being done to sort of lift up this history, and it's very important. It's also important that you kind of have some context that slavery in America was a small part of something much bigger called the North Atlantic slave trade that had been going on for about a century before those 20 Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619. And you have actually some, because we're talking about, the estimates are between 10 and 12 million Africans were taken off the continent and, you know, were sent to the Americas. Now, Henry Louis Gates, you know, he approximates that it's about 11 million Africans. And if you want to study the breakdown of Africans and where they ended up, that's something that's very surprising, because you're talking about over 5 million Africans were shipped to Brazil versus there were about 450,000 Africans that ended up in America. Now, of course, You know, when you get to the plantation system, they learn how to breed Africans. Those numbers will increase significantly. But when you're talking about the sheer number of Africans taken off the continent and brought to the Americas, North America got a small percentage. Places like Haiti, Jamaica got over 1 million. Places like Haiti, over 700,000. Mexico, over 550,000 Africans. So this is why you will see people of African descent spread out all over North, Central, and South America. It all has roots to the North Atlantic slave trade. Now, what's interesting about this history is how slavery evolves in America. Now, a common mistake we make when we start thinking about slavery in America is we focus on the sort of antebellum period, which is the period right, the 1800s leading up to the Civil War. We focus on the sort of plantation model, and we sort of paint the entire history of slavery, thinking that that's the way it always was, and really that's not the case. And the PowerPoint slides will kind of give you a little context, like slavery in the state of Virginia from 1619 to about 1661 was a completely different system. They were really more debt slaves instead of being involved in what's called chattel slavery. A debt slave is a person who sells themselves, who has been sold by someone into slavery. They have to work for a period of time, and then they can be free. And so these Africans that initially arrived in Virginia in 1619 were eventually experienced a modicum of freedom. They were able to own property. Some of them even owned other African slaves, had access to some of the ports on the East Coast, and were able to travel. So that's a kind of different picture. Now, do pay attention in these history books when they're talking about this historical period. They will use words like some, and that is important because, again, the masses of Africans that came to America, most of them, they were disenfranchised. But it is important to sort of lift up and to show that there was some differences between slavery in the colonial era versus slavery in the antebellum period. So this is why it's important to understand that what slavery does in America is that it evolves. Because initially, debt slavery was a big thing, but then over time, laws start being passed. They tried to enslave Native Americans. They tried to enslave using the sort of debt slavery model with even, whites from Europe. But eventually, there was just a series of events where African labor was cheaper. It was more difficult for Africans to run away and to be able to blend in. It was much easier for Native Americans who they knew the area, they knew the terrain. It was easier for whites if they wanted to escape the debt slavery system to maybe go to another village. There were just more impediments for Africans, and Africans kind of had experience farming, and so there were a lot of different reasons that there's a conflation of those factors, legal factors. Then they started adding the sort of racial pieces to it as well. The country really sort of concretizes this model that Africans are the ones who are supposed to be enslaved. And Ira Berlin sort of gives, I think, some very, very helpful context on one of the slides to sort of talk about some of the differences between how Africans experience America in the colonial period versus the masses who will follow. Their experience will be qualitatively different. The reason? Economics, okay? Tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton, all right? These staples, which are the foundation of the American economy, okay? As there is a greater demand for these staples, then we get the creation of the plantation system, okay? It's almost like, an early form of like factories that requires masses of people. You need cheap labor so that the profits are high. So the plantation system gets created, and that sort of becomes the sort of dominant model. So when we think about slavery in America, a lot of times we're really thinking about the plantation system. So it's kind of important to understand that. Another interesting fact that's a part of this history is to understand that the church in America supported slavery. And I got a couple slides to kind of talk about, hey, you had now, and by the time you get to the antebellum era, churches are debating the issue of slavery. But you had a lot of churches they didn't have a problem with Africans being enslaved, with Africans being exploited economically. You have churches who were profiting financially off of the slave trade. You have churches who their members are slaveholders, giving money to the church. So the church's hands dripping with blood in this. The church used the Bible to defend slavery. Sometimes they would intentionally prohibit Africans from attending their churches, or when they would allow them to attend church, they made them sit on the balcony and told them to be quiet. And they couldn't really pray. There was even debates in America whether we want to even expose the Christian religion to people of African descent. So the church is a part of this history, and it's important to kind of understand that, Christianity played a pretty significant role in this whole system of slavery and systemic oppression. And you're going to hear some of that coming out in the writings, in the speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, let's shift gears as we start to wind down the presentation, because I also want you to understand that 1865, everybody's like, oh yeah, the Civil War ended, the South was defeated. You get the 13th, 14th Amendment, ratified, says, hey, slavery is unconstitutional. So there's, and there are people who really think this way. They think, hey, slavery and systemic oppression ended in 1869 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, also with, Emancipation Proclamation issued by then President Abraham Lincoln. That's not the case. All right, and I'll give you 3 real examples that disenfranchisement and systemic oppression continued even after 1865. The examples I use are, I talk about the black codes that are really based on the slave codes from the antebellum period. So you have these, all these white anxieties in the South about, all these blacks are free now. They fear that there's going to be this massive crime wave. And there's a book that you have to read. It's a book called Slavery by Another Name. Slavery by Another Name. And in that book, it documents basically how, and he, like even in the state of Alabama, for example, thousands upon thousands of pages of court documents showing how Africans would just be arrested on frivolous charges. Okay, you can go and read these court documents. Charges like disobeying their former master. Wait a minute, if you're a free person, why are you supposed to still be obeying someone who used to own you? If they catch you on the street and you don't have a job, okay, they don't care anything about, is there a system in place to employ you? No, they don't care. They will arrest you. They created all these vagrancy laws, and then what will end up happening is then you end up back in some form of what's probably more akin to debt slavery, working in lumber yards, working on mines, working to produce wealth for someone else, and not being able to sort of take care of yourself. So these people were being forced, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands of African Americans still working as debt slaves all the way up until World War II. Okay, so this is a part of the history. People just think, oh, these things went away. No, actually the system just morphed. You also have another example I gave is, of course, then the Jim Crow system, which would restrict access for African Americans. You had the passing of Plessy versus Ferguson, this whole idea about being separate but equal. And when African Americans, again, aren't given an opportunity, all right, to build up their own communities, have to not be able to access the wealth centuries of their labor has generated. So by separating them from the mainstream of society, it's just another form of systemic oppression and disenfranchising them. And you have to understand that, because look, this is what Dr. King is going to try to do. Because what is important to understand about the history of slavery and racism in America is that it was always about the money. Okay, all our major social systems in this country, whether we're talking about our political system, our economic system, our educational system, and our religious system, all owe their roots and their origin to this 240 plus year period where all this wealth was being generated that African Americans did not have access to. If you think about the first president of the United States, all slaveholders, okay, all built large sums of wealth and used the wealth generated by slavery to then gain political power and to become our quote unquote founding fathers. They would not be founding fathers having been a part of the construction of, the United States Constitution if it was not for the wealth they were able to generate from slavery and then leverage that wealth to access and gain political power. So you do have to understand that when you're thinking about slavery, I tell my students this all the time. You have to think about two things. You have to think about slavery tries to, yes, dehumanize people of African descent with all of these stereotypes and lies that, Africans are not as intelligent as other persons. Africans are emotional and they're out of control sexually, and all of these just sort of myths about people of African descent. So there is the dehumanization piece that's there, but you can't just think about the dehumanization piece. Slavery is also about economic exploitation. And it's pretty clear. Now, I spend plenty of time giving you some information and some context so that you kind of understand. Our American university and college system was built on the backs of the enslaved. And some of these schools, think about these Ivy League schools with endowments in the billions. I mean, just sitting on tons and tons of money, some of that money owing its roots back to this slavery era. Then you're going to have, institutions like historic black colleges and universities, who some of them have no endowment or just a small fraction of percent of the wealth that these large, wealthy white institutions have that go all the way back to the days of slavery. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, William and Mary, all very, very wealthy institutions. And this is what we're talking about. So there's an important graphic and chart that's on the PowerPoint presentation that sort of shows the dilemma we are in as we're thinking about what to do with the impact that slavery has had in this country. And I'm here with my left hand, you have white persons and white institutions, and here on my right hand you have black persons and black institutions. And the gap that you have between my left and my right hand, this gap basically helps us to understand the disparities that this 300 plus years, because not only do you have over 240 years of slavery, then you have this another 103 years of segregation with the black codes, Jim Crow segregation, and the work documented in the book Slavery by Another Name. It just creates disparities. So when you start looking at every category, whether it's healthcare, wealth, economics, you will see from a demographic standpoint, whites are here, blacks are here. And the reason is because that's what the system created this. The system engineered this. Anytime you see something that just keeps replicating the same end, it's not individual persons. No, the system was created this way. So my question to you, how do you fix the system? How do you correct this? Now, in America, our national narrative likes to say the way to correct this is going forward, we're going to focus on equality. Everybody's the same. Everybody has access to the same things. Okay, that's what they say in theory, not whether that's actually the case. But But theoretically, they say, going forward from, after the 1960s, civil rights movement's over. Now everything's just we're all equal now. Now, if the system's like this and we remain equal, does the system change? So this is why what the biblical tradition calls for, what the Christian tradition calls for, is justice. And I introduce you to an important quote from an Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann, who defines justice as giving back to those what is rightfully theirs. Because if there is an unjust system, that means people have been given certain privileges that they have not shared with people who have been systemically disenfranchised. So when I talk about that word systemic, that is an important term. We're not talking about people who are prejudiced and want to call black people the N-word. No, we're talking about there are laws on the books that people were legally shut out of a system, legally marginalized, legally exploited, legally not allowed to thrive for centuries. So what justice is, justice means we have to fix the system first. And once the system is fixed like this, then we can start talking about equality. But you can't say equality is going to really rectify this history, because equality just basically means we go forward and we keep the system like this. So what Dr. King is trying to do, he's trying to do about three things. When you're doing justice work, you're challenging, you're exposing the import of this history. You're challenging systems, basically saying, hey, slavery has created inequities. We have to address these inequities. And so justice work is has this confrontational piece to it, saying, hey, the system has done something that's wrong. It has benefited some people, and it has significantly impaired and exploited and taken advantage of other people. And then the third thing that justice work tries to do is to, suggest practical ways to correct the system so that everyone can thrive. So I think this kind of gives you a very, very helpful and important insight and window into what Dr. King was trying to do. And so I hope that this will be helpful. Read through those slides, and we'll be talking about this going forward in class. Thank you.